You're doing it wrong." I looked up from the limestone wall. A woman in a hard hat and dusty boots was staring at me with the kind of patience that was one mistake away from becoming irritation. "The mortar," she said. "You're pressing too hard. You'll crack it." I loosened my grip. "Better," she said, and walked away. That was my first conversation with Elena Vasquez. She had no idea she was talking to the man who owned everything she was standing on. My name is Marcus Hargrove, 3 skyscrapers in Manhattan, a shipping empire across 4 continents, a fortune large enough to make seasoned investors go quiet when I enter a room. But that morning, I was nobody. Worn jeans, faded flannel, steel-toed boots I'd bought 3 days earlier and scuffed deliberately against my garage floor so they wouldn't look new. I had one goal: find out if Elena was real. Not the version my mother had carefully curated and quietly approved. Not the woman who appeared at charity galas with the right smile at the right moment. Not the architect whose portfolio my assistant had printed and placed on my desk with a yellow sticky note that said, "She's the one, sir," as if my life's most important decision could be summarized on adhesive paper. I needed to see her. The real her. The unguarded her. She existed at 7 in the morning when she thought nobody important was watching, because I had made a quiet, private, absolute. If I was going to give a woman my name, my trust, access to the interior of a life I had spent decades fortifying, I needed to know who she was in the mud, not at the gala, in the mud. And so I put on the boots, and I went to find out. The Hargrove estate renovation had been in planning for 8 months. The East Wing original construction, 1887, needed structural restoration. My property manager had fielded bids from 11 firms. Elena's firm had won on merit alone. I had made sure through channels quiet enough to leave no fingerprints that her team had no idea who the client was until after the contract was signed. By then, I had already been watching site reports, foreman updates, the particular way that old Gus, 30 years in construction, allergic to compliments, talked about the new architect. "She ain't like the others, boss." I'd asked him what he meant. He'd thought about it for a moment, the way men do when they're trying to find words for something they usually just feel. "She eats lunch with the crew," he finally said. "It sounds small. It isn't. I know the difference between people who perform humility and people who simply don't think about hierarchy when they're hungry. One of them is a strategy. The other is a character." I needed to know which one Elena was. Day 1, on site, I kept my distance and watched. She arrived before anyone else. No grand entrance, no assistant trailing behind her with a tablet and a coffee. Just Elena, a worn leather satchel, and a thermos she refilled twice from the crew's communal coffee station without a moment's hesitation. By 8 in the morning, she had already walked the entire east perimeter, crouched at 3 different points to examine the foundation, and had a 15-minute conversation with the structural engineer that I could tell even from where I stood was more collaboration than instruction. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, people leaned in slightly, not because she was loud, because something in her voice carried the particular weight of someone who had already thought 3 steps ahead and was now generously bringing you along. I found myself leaning in too, and I was standing 40 feet away. By midday, I had been assigned to assist with materials logging clipboard work, mostly inventory checks, the kind of task that keeps you moving through the site without attracting attention. It put me close to her, close enough, eventually, for her to hand me a list and say, "Cross-reference these against what's in the north storage unit. Flag anything that doesn't match." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She looked at me for just a half-second longer than necessary. "You're new," she said. "First week." She nodded once and moved on. I stood there holding her list. Marcus Hargrove, who had once negotiated a $4 billion acquisition over a lunch that lasted 40 minutes, was holding a clipboard, and his hands were not entirely steady. If this story is already pulling you in, you're exactly who this is for. Stay with me. It gets so much deeper. Day 2. I watched her handle a dispute between 2 subcontractors, a plumber and an electrician who both needed access to the same section of the West Corridor and had arrived at that particular wall with the energy of men who had been quietly hostile to each other since approximately the previous administration. Elena didn't assert authority. She didn't raise her voice or pull rank or remind anyone who was running the site. She asked questions. Specific, unhurried questions to one man, then the other, until both of them were talking more than she was. And somehow, through the architecture of her curiosity, they arrived at a solution that neither of them had come in with. When they walked away in opposite directions, but without tension, I realized what I'd just witnessed. She hadn't solved their problem. She had made them solve it themselves. I had a VP of operations. I paid $600,000 a year who could not do what I had just watched this woman do in 11 minutes while standing on a dusty floor in steel-toed boots. I went back to my clipboard. I didn't trust my face. Day 2 also brought the apprentice. He was young, maybe 22, with the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that a mistake they made is more expensive than they initially hoped. He'd miscalculated a load-bearing measurement. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't nothing either. It meant rework. It meant time. I waited for her to come down on him. I'd built a career in rooms where mistakes were handled loudly, where accountability looked like theater, where the point was never really corrected. It was demonstration. Show everyone else what happens. Elena crouched down to his level. Literally, he was sitting on an overturned crate, and she started asking him questions. Not how you got this question wrong. Walk me through your thinking questions. For 40 minutes, she sat with this kid and turned his mistake into a lesson so thoroughly and so specifically his that by the end of it, he wasn't just corrected, he was better. You could see it in his posture. The difference between a man who has been disciplined and a man who has been developed. He thanked her. She waved it off like it was nothing. It was not nothing. I had fired men in glass-walled boardrooms for less than what that kid had done, and I had done it in ways I was no longer entirely proud of. I stood at the edge of that moment and felt something uncomfortable move through me. The quiet, specific discomfort of recognizing that someone is better at something important than you are not a skill, not a strategy, but a way of being with people. I went home that night, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I didn't turn on any lights. Day 3, I made my move. We were at the east wall, the original 1887 limestone that had become, in some quiet way, the emotional center of the entire restoration project. Why not just replace it, I asked. Concrete's faster, cheaper, easier to work with. Elena stopped what she was doing. She straightened up slowly and looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has answered a version of this question before and has made peace with the fact that they will answer it again. Because this wall has been standing since 1887, she said. It survived 2 world wars, 4 different owners, a fire in 1932 that took the entire north wing, and a renovation in the 1970s where somebody... She paused, and her voice dropped a fraction. Somebody actually tried to panel over it with drywall. She said drywall the way other people say betrayal. Concrete would last 20 years, she continued. It would be fine, functional. It will pass every inspection. She looked back at the wall. But it wouldn't be this. It wouldn't have memory. It wouldn't be the thing that was actually here. She turned to me. This house deserves to stay itself, not a replica of itself. Itself. I didn't say anything. I couldn't, because I was standing in front of a woman who had just articulated about a wall the exact philosophy by which I had tried to build every company I had ever created, and she didn't even know she'd done it. Stay itself, not a replica of itself. How many times had I sat in boardrooms and fought for the soul of something against people who wanted the cheaper version? How many times had I refused to sand down an edge or dilute a vision because the market wanted something more palatable? She was talking about limestone. I was hearing my own life's work reflected back at me. You're right, I said. She looked at me with mild surprise, like agreement was not what she'd been braced for. I know, she said simply, and went back to work. I laughed on the inside for the first time in months. Hit that like button if Elena just became your favorite person in the room. Because it's the same. Keep watching Day 4 changes everything. Day 4, it rained. The kind of rain that doesn't negotiate, it simply arrives and rearranges everyone's plans. The crew scattered for cover in vehicles and the main hall. Tools were covered. Work stopped. Elena and I ended up under the wide overhang of the east portico, just the 2 of us. The rain came down in sheets across the grounds, and we stood side by side watching it, and for several minutes, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward. That was the thing that stayed with me afterward. It wasn't awkward. Most silences with people I don't know well have a texture to them, an expectation, a low-grade social pressure to fill the space. This one didn't. We just stood there, watching the rain, and it felt like something I hadn't felt in a very long time: rest. "You don't talk much," she said eventually. "I listen," I said. She turned to look at me then. Really look. The way people look at you when they're deciding whether you're being genuine or performing depth. Whatever she decided, she smiled, quick, unguarded. The first real one I'd seen, not the professional smile she deployed in meetings, not the polite one she offered when someone made a mediocre joke. This one came from somewhere underneath all that. It hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. "Gus says that's rare around here," she said. "Gus is wise." "He really is." She looked back at the rain. "He told me on my first day, this site has a way of showing people who they actually are. Give it time." She paused. "I've been thinking about that ever since." "What have you concluded?" She considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. "That he's right," she said. "You see a lot, working alongside people. The ones who help without being asked. The ones who take a little extra when they think no one's counting. The ones who show up differently when they think someone important is watching." She tilted her head slightly. "People can't perform indefinitely. Eventually, they just become themselves." I kept my eyes on the rain. My heart rate was not entirely normal. "Do you know who owns this place?" she asked. The question landed quietly. "I've heard the name," I said carefully. "Marcus Hargrove." She said it the way you'd say any name, just the name, with no performance attached to it. No awe, no particular resentment, just the information. "I've never met him. I don't know much about him personally." She was quiet for a moment. "But I keep thinking about whoever commissioned the original build. 1887. They wanted something that would last, not just structurally, they wanted something with intention in every choice. You can feel it in the decisions they made. Nothing was arbitrary. Nothing was chosen for convenience." She paused. "Whatever you build with real integrity outlives you. It becomes something people take care of, something people fight for." She wasn't talking about me. She didn't know she was talking to me. And yet every word was landing like she'd aimed it. "I hope he understands what he has," she said. I looked at her then at the side of her face, at the rain reflected in her eyes, at the woman who had spent 4 days being entirely, uncomplicatedly herself, without any awareness that it mattered, without any effort to perform, without anything to gain. "I think he's beginning to," I said quietly. She nodded slowly, still watching the rain. "Good," she said. "Some things are worth understanding before it's too late to act on it." We stood there until the rain slowed. Then she picked up her satchel and went back to work, and I stood under that portico for another few minutes, alone, feeling something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost stopped believing it was still available to me. Certainty. Day 5. Everything changed. I hadn't planned for it to happen that day. I'd told myself I would give it another week. Let it breathe, be sure. But certainty. Once it arrives, don't wait politely. I was on a call, a brief one, necessary, unavoidable, and I had stepped away from the main site toward the far end of the portico. I kept my voice low. I was careful. Not careful enough. I didn't see her. Come around the corner. I don't know exactly what she heard. A name, probably. A number. The particular way I speak when I'm not performing anonymously is when I slip without noticing back into the register of someone accustomed to being listened to. I ended the call. I turned around. She was standing 6 feet away. Her face was doing something complicated, not one emotion, but several moving across it in sequence, like weather. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that settled, heavy and still, into an expression I can only describe as the look of someone recalibrating. She set her clipboard down on the nearest surface. She folded her arms, and she looked at me. Not with the heat of anger. I could have handled anger. Anger has edges you can work with. This was something quieter and more serious, and it cost me more than I expected. It was disappointing. "How long?" she said. Not a question, a reckoning. 5 days on site, I said. 6 weeks from a distance. The second number landed. I watched it land. 6 weeks, she repeated. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The site moved around us, the sounds of work resuming after the rain. Hammers and voices and machinery, and the two of us stood inside a pocket of stillness that felt entirely separate from all of it. "And what exactly," she said, were you looking for? I could have softened it. I had the vocabulary for those years of boardrooms and negotiations that had given me a full toolkit for making difficult things sound reasonable, for framing, for managing perception. I didn't use any of it. I needed to know if you were real, I said, the version of you I had been shown at the events. In your portfolio, in everything that was presented to me, I didn't know if that was you or a construction, a very good, very well-maintained construction. I paused. I couldn't make the most important decision of my life based on a construction. She held my gaze. And you decided that the way to resolve that question, she said, was to deceive me. The word deceive sat between us. I didn't flinch from it. Yes, I said. Something shifted in her face, like she'd been prepared for deflection and my directness had disarmed her slightly. Not enough to soften her, but enough to make her keep listening. Say what you need to say, I told her. All of it. She unfolded her arms. She walked a few steps away from me, looked at the limestone wall, at all the careful, painstaking work we had done together over 5 days, and then she turned back. Do you know what I find interesting? She said. Tell me. You spent 6 weeks trying to determine if I was performing. Her voice was controlled but not cold. And the entire time, you were performing. You were someone else entirely. You were wearing a costume and asking me questions from behind it. She tilted her head. So, the man who wanted to know if I was real, was that man real? The question hit somewhere undefended. I took a moment before I answered. The questions were real, I said. The things I was looking for, the way you treated people, the way you made decisions, the way you were when you thought nothing was at stake, those weren't performance. Those were the things I actually needed to know. The flannel shirt was a costume, but what I was looking for was true. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I became aware of my own heartbeat. Most people would call this a test, she said finally. I know. A test implies you appointed yourself the judge, that I was the subject and you were the evaluation. She paused. That's a significant amount of power to take without asking. Yes, I said. It is. But, she stopped, looked at me carefully. I don't think that's entirely what this was. I waited. I think you're not as composed as you appear, Marcus. She said my name for the first time, the real name, not the new hire name, and it landed differently in her mouth than it did in anyone else's. Without theater, without weight, just the name, belonging to a person she was choosing, in this moment, to see clearly. I think a man who has everything finds it almost impossible to locate what's genuine. I think you've spent so long in rooms where everything is managed, every impression, every relationship, every interaction curated for what you represent rather than who you are, that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply trust what's in front of you. She took a step closer. I think you put on those boots because you were scared, and I think that fear, that specific, honest, very human fear, is the most real thing you've shown me since you got here. I didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was entirely without a prepared response. I don't entirely forgive it, she said. I want to be clear about that. What you did had costs. I worked alongside you for 5 days, believing we were just colleagues. Some of what I said, things I said honestly, without guard. I said them to someone I thought was a stranger, and now I find out they weren't strangers at all. They were an audience. She shook her head slightly. That's a strange feeling. I need time with it. I understand, I said. But I also... She stopped again. I looked at the wall again, looked back at me. I understand why you did it. Not because it was right, but because I know what it is to protect something you can't afford to lose. I know what it is to be so careful about the important things that you sometimes go too far in the direction of caution. She almost smiled. Not quite. We're not so different in that way, she said. If you've made it this far, subscribe right now, because the people who stay till the end are exactly who this channel is built for. The silence that followed was different from the silence under the portico in the rain. That one had been resting. This one was a decision. I could feel it, the moment balancing between two possible futures. The one where she picked up her satchel and her professionalism and her dignity, and she walked away from this site and from me, and I would have had no legitimate claim to stop her. And the other one. The one that required something from both of us. What would it take, I asked quietly, to earn the forgiveness that isn't there yet. She looked at me for a long moment. Honesty, she said. Not strategy. Not management. Honesty, the kind that costs you something. Ask me anything, I said. She thought about it. Why me? She said. Not my portfolio. Not my firm. Not the reasons your family had. Why? When you decided this mattered, why was it me you needed to be sure of? The honest answer was not a comfortable one, because every other person in my life, every relationship, every advisor, every person who has told me they love me or respect me or need me, I can trace a line, I said slowly.